My name is Tom Geldart, and I'm Director of Communications and Media for Chelmsford Diocese, and a very warm welcome to our first online church webinar this evening. Our guest speaker this evening is the Reverend Alan Moss. Alan is a curate in Collier Row, and since the spring he's been working 1 day a week with us in the communications team to develop an understanding of what's happened with online church over recent months, to explore some of the thinking about the future of online church, and to look at how we in the communications team can support churches in developing that. And this training programme is one of the outputs from that work, and indeed we're very much looking forward to meeting and hearing from you to get further input on how we can support and help you. More from Alan very soon, but first I want to run through how this evening's webinar will work and what we hope to get out of it. First of all, a few housekeeping rules just to make sure everything runs smoothly. If I can ask you to stay on mute, there will be various times where we may bring in people, at which point if you could take yourself off mute for that and then go back onto mute. But there's a good number of us on the call this evening, so it's helpful if people stay on mute so that we so there isn't interference, noise, etc. Secondly, we'll do a question and answer session at the end. So if you could put any questions you have at any point throughout into the chat box, we'll then deal with those questions at the end of the webinar. We'll also be recording the main plenary sessions. We'll do some breakout groups as well, but we'll record the main plenary sessions so that people can look back at this, and people who haven't been able to join can use it. If for any reason, and most of the time people won't be shown in that because the way it records will record whoever the main speaker is, but if for any reason you're not comfortable with yourself appearing in that final video, just message me during the session and we'll make sure that the final cut we put out is edited correctly. And then just finally, before we look at the agenda and what we're hoping to get out of this evening's webinar, I want to introduce two other people who are with us this evening as well. Sarah Newman, who some of you may well know, is the Communications and Media Executive at the Diocese and works very closely with me in the communications team. And James Cottis runs a company called Digital Spirit, who supply the website for the diocese and many of our churches across the diocese, and works very closely with us on digital communications as well. And we'll hopefully and probably hear more from James and Sarah when we get onto the question and answer session later on. So let's briefly just look at the agenda and how things will pan out during the course of the webinar. Okay, so we're starting off now with introductions, and we're looking at a moment at what we hope to get out of the webinar. We'll then break you into breakout groups to introduce yourselves to each other and talk a little bit about what you're hoping to get out of this evening. We'll then talk to Alan about the piece of work that he's been doing. And then I'll talk a little bit about how some of that thinking can be turned into practical planning for parish digital communications. We'll then do another breakout group to give people an opportunity to take some of that discussion and thinking and talk about how it might work in their own context, and then we'll finish up with a closing question and answer. I think it's fair to say this evening's webinar will be quite sort of reflective, theoretical. You'll see perhaps from some of the others that we'll be running through the autumn and winter that some of them are much more practical. So for example, the next one will be about live streaming and using video, so much more practical. So the webinars will vary considerably. In terms of the learning outcomes from this evening, what we hope people will take away. We'll share primarily through Alan's presentation some of the learning about what's happened with online church and the development of it, particularly over recent months, as churches have grappled and responded to the horrific things that have been going on with coronavirus. And how that translates into some of the future about where online church goes from here, both in the short term and then also in the longer term. We hope we can equip you with some practical tools and ideas to help you think about this in your own context, in your own parishes. And we hope that this will give us an opportunity, and has given us an opportunity, to bring people together who are embarking on similar journeys in different contexts across the diocese, so that you can meet each other and share ideas and stories and thoughts about how we use online church together. So that is what we hope to get out of this evening. But the first thing we're going to do is go into some breakout groups. So there's obviously too many of us on to introduce everyone in the webinar itself, but we'll put you into some smaller groups. And in those groups, if you could ask someone if you could appoint someone to report back in just a couple of minutes to the wider group, and then in your conversations, just go around, introduce yourselves to each other and explain why you signed up for tonight's webinar and what you hope to gain from it this evening. And then if the people who are reporting back could focus in particular on that second point, what people in the group hope to gain from the webinar and whether there are any sort of key themes coming through, and we'll try and adapt the content to reflect that. So you'll be in the groups for 10 minutes and then we'll do the reporting back afterwards. So James is driving the groups. I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint screen. I think that will help James break people into groups. You'll get a prompt asking you to accept the input into the breakout group, and you'll probably need to unmute yourself once you're in there. Okay, James.
So what we're going to do is we'll take the questions and if we can go around the chats and stuff. So if you were the note taker in the chat, if you can sort of just drop your name in the chat now, and then what I'll do is I'll unmute you and put you on speaker and stuff, and you can maybe just tell everyone else the sort of things that came out of your breakout rooms. So if anyone wants to go first and just put their details in the chat, I will unmute you. Sarah Newman, that's a good start.
Do you want me to go?
There we go, Sarah, you go.
There you go. How did I know you'd come to me first? Right, so I was in breakout room 4. So the main points from our group was people wanted to kind of get a basic intro of digital comms, acknowledging that a lot of congregations are old, and making the point that and finding out how we can make digital comms accessible to everybody. There was also a point about being online, meaning that there's no geographical kind of boundaries. So you're not restricted to kind of just participating in worship within your own geographic kind of parish. You can be part of kind of multiple communities and be able to talk to people that wouldn't necessarily kind of come to a church building. And also just a general opportunity of wanting to learn, reflect and share with others.
Brilliant, fantastic. Right, Ian Scott Thompson, if you can go next, I'll just ask you to unmute.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, we had a lovely group of, well, sort of quite varied experience. But one question was, how do you cope with streaming your service on social media and having a group that's just online? Does that form two groups? How do you connect the two? How do you get participation? And then secondly, how do you reach people outside of services, you know, genuine outreach? And how do you draw people in and get participation in a useful way online, especially with families and family worship?
That's great, fantastic. Thank you for that. I'm now going to go to Can Salvador, so breakout room number 1.
Hi,
thank you.
Good evening, everyone. In our group, we have also a very exciting group, and mostly of our group was thinking of how can the diocese help the church to make it more accessible to other people, especially those who wants to hear about the streaming, live streaming, Zoom, and also the mostly like us, like me and my church, elderly people didn't have a laptop or didn't have live stream. They want only the over the phone. How can we communicate with that as well? And of course, curiosity of others and how do we learn. That's why I designed this tonight, because they want to learn of more, not only live stream, not only Zoom, but how we can communicate with each other in YouTube or anything that make us communicate to others.
That's great, fantastic. Thank you for that. John Saxon, I'm going to go to yourself next.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Breakout Room 5, we had quite a mix of people's experiences and context, as it were, but wherever we were on our digital exploration, I think we all wanted to network with others and learn from each other and support each other and build those communities where we can do the best that we can do. There are some people that literally signed up to Zoom yesterday, to others that are quite experienced Zoomers. And I think there was a seek and a yearning to use the online process, as it were, to keep communities together. That might be communities within the church or between churches in a more rural benefice. And then there was some quite specific questions, or at least one, is how do you get online services streaming going in a very rural, network deprived area?
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. And last one, I'm just going to go to Isabel Adcock. So if I can ask you to unmute and you can share what your group had.
Hello. Yeah, we were a varied group from north of the county to south of the county. Most people have been doing various services. A lot of it was want some help with practical details and maybe what's next. And what do people find that works and what doesn't work? So tips and hints on things. What particularly, I think we were talking more about what we can do in the future. Where are we going with this? So how do we make communities out of the people who are online? How do we connect with them? And somebody came up at the end with, what about Christmas? What are we all going to be doing for Christmas? Because obviously it's going to be very different.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. That's really been some great feedback from everyone. Actually, it's been really interesting sort of hearing how all the groups and stuff, what the conversations have been going on in the breakout rooms. I'm now going to pass across to Alan, and Alan will share his screen. He's got a presentation he's going to run, and Alan's going to sort of talk a bit more about this. So Alan, over to you.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Alan, and obviously we've suddenly lost Tom, who was our PowerPoint man. and I'm sure he will be.
He's just coming back.
Oh, is he? Oh, okay, that's good.
Have you got the PowerPoint there, or?
I actually, I do. I have an older version of the PowerPoint. Tom's got my new shiny one, but
Would you want to talk a little about yourself?
Yeah.
While
Oh,
Tom's
I'm
just
good.
coming
I'm good at that. I'm happy to talk about myself. That's my speciality. So my name is Alan, and I am a third year, sort of final year curate, based in Romford, down on the sort of East London Essex border. Some people will know it. I think there's a few people that are from this area. I think I've seen a few. And so the reason that I'm kind of talking really around this sort of subject is that a few years ago, well, I should start before that. For the last sort of 20 years or so, I've been a youth worker and sort of doing stuff around engaging young people, particularly outreach and mission and opening youth centres and stuff like that. And a few years ago, when I went off to train for my ordination, I stumbled across this really fascinating and extremely relevant world of digital theology and this kind of new world that we inhabit so smoothly and so well, and it sort of crept up on us, and it's really sort of fascinated me ever since. So since being a curate, part of obviously my role has been, doing what curates do, learning the ropes of being a priest, etc. But alongside that, as Tom mentioned earlier on, I've also been working with the diocesan team, comms team, just to work out, particularly through the pandemic. We've all sort of been chucked in the deep end, and I just kind of wanted to offer a little bit of hope and a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to some of this stuff. So I don't know if Tom's back yet.
Apologies, everyone. I
There
have
he
a
is.
serious internet outage of the week, and it came at a very bad time. But I am back.
Cool. So,
do you want me to share your slides, Alan?
Yes, please, buddy. Yeah. I mean, I can carry on talking about myself. It's up to you. Just put questions. I'm happy to take them.
Okay.
There we go. Great. So, so this is what we're talking about tonight, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about the transfer, translate, and transform language in a moment. But the most important word on this particular side is conversation, because this is what we're having, and this is what we want to encourage and continue as we move forward. That this is a conversation. I'm sorry if you come here tonight for super answers and we're going to solve all your problems, but this is just to get the conversation started. I just wanted to base it just in a little bit of scripture. There's a part in Chronicles where they've come to fight alongside their king, to rally alongside David, and there's a particular tribe that is mentioned, the Issachar tribe, and they understood the times and knew what Israel should do. And the reason I kind of threw that really random little Bible quote in there was because we're in a point in our history as a world, as a nation, etc., where actually it's so important for us. One of the biggest weapons in our arsenal is to look around us and take in the culture that we live in and ask ourselves, what's going on? Do we understand the times? And that's a little bit of what I'm trying to aim to do. And then the other part there, the quote there from Hebrews, is to ground us in it says there that in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets. And then the most important part there, at many times and in various ways. God, I believe, is a God who's always spoken and reached out in all kinds of forms, whether it's through miracles, whether it's through prophets, via the Holy Spirit, all these kind of ways. God is a God who wants to speak to us, and God does that in many various ways, and he's been doing that since the world began. And so what I wanted to say was, this is not anything new. This God is a media God, if you like. And then that little thing there, this is a digital kairos moment for us. It's our chance to try and understand the times that we live in. So if we could have the next slide, please, Tom. So defining the digital landscape, everything has changed but nothing is new. And I'm just aware that for a lot of clergy, or even if you're not clergy, whatever it is, people feel isolated, and you might be feeling like, you know, I'm starting from scratch and I'm completely, you know, this is completely out of the blue. I wasn't expecting it. And so what I want to start by doing is by kind of building a little bit of a foundation, a framework for us to kind of look back from where we've come from as a culture, particularly over the last 70 or so years, in order to help us to discern how we can move forward. So hopefully the next slide will help me do that a little bit more. There we go. So I like this slide. And because this slide in particular, it kind of points out the fact that for those of us who think that, you know, this is all just brand new stuff, in some ways, in the larger scheme of things, it is. But actually, the digital revolution, or as we've come to know it, has been happening over the last 60 or 70 years. And some say it goes back even further than you see the earliest point on that little infographic there is 1947. But I wanted to throw this up just to say that actually we're building on the shoulders of giants. We're not alone in this. The digital revolution has almost unnoticed flown into our everyday life, into our culture, into our world. And there were just a few points on here that I just wanted to pull out. So obviously the main one there, 1947, the transistor is invented. That's when our kind of digital journey started to begin, when people started to think about digitizing information, etc. And I'm not going to really go through into detail from this whole thing, but just a few key points I want to point out. I was really fascinated by the fact that in 1971, the first email was sent. I don't know if you can see there. I don't know what the email was actually meant, but it's just a few random letters. But in 1971, the first email was sent. In 1981, you speed on just 10 years later, the first of what we might now call laptops came into existence. When, I don't know if any of you had big IBMs when you were younger or anything like that, you know, the old dial-up modem, the noises and everything, it brings back all kinds of things. But that's when 1981, 1989 to 1990-ish, the launch of the internet. Some of you may feel like it's always been here, but it hasn't. It really hasn't. It hasn't even been in the world that long. But 1989 to 1990, the internet was birthed, if you like, and all of a sudden things started to change. I want to jump forward. There's so much interesting stuff here, and I think we're going to share some of these slides and stuff afterwards. People can get access to this if you want it. But if we jump forward to the year 2000, I always called it the year 2000. I get told off for doing that. But at the turn of the century, I don't know about you again, I just thought broadband had always existed. I figured Noah had this on the ark, but actually it was coming to being broadband, coming to be in 2000, and it changed the game. All of a sudden, we were connected in a faster way, in a more global way, and the game changed. And then another little thing there that I wanted to note was in 2004, Facebook, another game changer. Not long after that, YouTube, social media platforms, Apple Macs, iPhones. Suddenly the world began to change in an even more rapid way. We went from big significant changes over decades to happening over the periods of months, which brings us up to the present day. And then if we go on to the next slide, if that's all right, Tom. So what I really want to draw out through this little talk is that through the evolution of technology, if you like, right from back in the 40s, we've come to a point now where we have identified something what scholars and others call the triple digital revolution. It's this combination of the internet, mobile devices, and social media. The idea that we're global, that we can access anywhere, we're mobile with it, we can access anywhere in the world whenever we want, and it's social, it connects people in a way that's never been done before, and it's revolutionized the way that we live our lives and that we live out our faith. And the next slide. And as this kind of, you know, emergence of technology has happened over the last sort of 60, 70 years or so, and then this triple revolution has occurred, the emergence of a whole new generation has happened at the same time. It's kind of hand in hand along the same route. We've had a whole new generation grow up immersed in the world of digital technology. And a term that we've got for them is actually by a teacher who coined these terms, called digital natives. So digital natives are those, you can see there for yourselves, those that were kind of born from the early mid-1990s that have never known a time before the internet existed, have never known a time before mobile phones existed. They're what we call digital native speakers of technology. It's just something that is part of their lives that they've always known. And then on the opposite side of that, you've got digital adopters, those that were born before that. I mean, I was in the right at the beginning of the 1980s, and even though technology was around in one form or another, even then, probably for most of us here, unless you were born before 1947, but in terms of the globalization of technology, those of us that were kind of born before the 90s, you know, we remember maybe a simpler time, maybe not, I don't know. If we go on to the next slide. The reason that that's so important is because whenever we seek to do mission, or we go to other places in the world or to other cultures, we seek to understand the culture that we are in. We seek to become native speakers, if you like, of that culture, and to then translate the good news of the gospel into wherever we find ourselves. But it strikes me that actually a new culture has grown up around us, and that we now can sometimes find ourselves on the back foot. COVID-19 has accelerated this digital revolution, some say by several decades, by the fact that before we were kind of learning as we go, but now all of a sudden we see the benefit of technology and we notice the dangers of technology, and we're all in the same boat, we're all in that deep end. And particularly if we're sort of more on the digital adopter side of things, we're trying to learn quickly. But the reason it's so important to do that is because we live in a new culture, and we need to learn a new language in order to reach people in a relevant way with the good news and the gospel. And then a little point I've put there, we live in times of isolation, we self-isolation, etc. But what I wanted to point out is that in our technological connected world, isolation does not have to mean the demise of innovation. In fact, it opens up new worlds and new ways of reaching people with the gospel, which may not even include our church buildings, as radical as that might seem. If we go on to the next slide, please, Tom. So what we did, we did a survey across the diocese, and we set out to take a snapshot of what's been happening through the COVID-19 situation, through the pandemic, to see what churches have done, how we've responded. We've sought to discover what we need to do in order to move forward. Where are the gaps that we need to fill? Where are we missing things? Where are we not seeing things? What are the barriers we need to overcome? And then all of this, the reason we've done this working with the bishops and others in the diocese is that we want to build a forward momentum, so that once the pandemic is over, and I believe one day it will be over, we don't want to lose what we've found. So that's what we set out to do. And the next slide. This was some of the survey. Again, I'll just point out one or two things. The fact that 64 responses were there, and 90% were from parish churches. Now, I don't know whether that means Fresh Expressions or others, you know, haven't got the same access or didn't know about it, or whatever it is. But it was interesting to me that actually parish churches really wanted to share their experience. And so that was kind of the biggest response to the survey that we put out there. And then again, 100% of people through that survey, for whether it was, I think even the cathedral responded as well. 100% of people said that they have increased their use of digital communication, either really significantly or even just a little bit. But I was really encouraged by that fact, that everyone is doing something. We realised there's a crisis, and we needed to be out there, and we responded. And then 88% feel that their use of digital communication has impacted the community in some sort of relevant way or strengthened relationships. If we go on to the next slide. Again, I'll let the stats kind of, or the stats sort of speak for themselves, really. 100% are using digital communication, particularly to stream worship and liturgy and lead prayer. I find that really encouraging, seeing some of what you guys have been doing and what others across the diocese have been doing. And then just the highlight there at the bottom in terms of time here, the top 3 barriers to using digital communication, which are kind of fed back to us, and I'm sure you'll feed more as well, were technical skills around limited and outdated equipment. I think someone said that a second ago in your feedback. And also about staffing. We can't do it all, particularly when you're running a church or running a ministry. Trying to do it all is difficult. So there's some significant barriers, and I'm not trying to answer those right now, but they're the things that have come back. So if anything, take encouragement. If you're feeling that way, if you're feeling, oh, maybe a bit left behind, be encouraged that you're not being left behind. We're all in this together. Go to the next. Lovely. And there's just a flashy, very colourful infographic there, which again, we send these out to people and you can have a little look. But just again, there you can see the move to prayer and worship and people engaging in all different kinds of way in order to try and keep that flow of ministry and spirituality flowing in our congregations and in our communities. You can look at that for yourself, because I know we're tight for time. If we go on to the next slide. So the other thing that we wanted to do was make sure that we are grounding everything that we're doing, all our research, all our conversations, in some strong theology. That's what I'm passionate about. That's what I really care about. And we just wanted to highlight a few things that have been going on. Even just that, I think they was only formed a couple of years ago, but the Church of England centrally has a team, a digital communications team, that are there to help and support all parishes, all dioceses, and they do something called DigiLabs. If you haven't come across that before, they've trained over 2,000 parishes since 2018 on all kinds of social media and building websites. Church Near You, which is an awesome resource. So I'd encourage you to look for that, DigiLabs. A lot of people asking some very practical questions, and we have got some practical sessions coming up over the next sort of few months, next few weeks. But do look into DigiLabs, really helpful. Some helpful articles, Everybody Welcome Online, and there's a new updated version of that called Everyone Welcome to the Future. There are a couple of faithful clergymen a bit further up north did some research and interviewed churches, and there's just some really, if you go online, you can find that Everybody Welcome Online, and there's some really encouraging and helpful practical ways that people across the country have been engaging with their communities, etc. So I encourage you to have a look at that. Really, really helpful. Then the next slide. So there's some other resources there. Again, these are all accessible online. They're PDFs which you can download. Maggie Savin-Baden and John Reed are there considering the relationship and the digital challenges that we're facing as a church and how we reach out in faith, and exploring some theological arguments, going a little bit deeper, as particularly around virtual sacraments, which I know has been a bit of a hot topic through this time. And then the one that I really want to come down on here is the distance church. It was a really helpful reflection on doing church online by a lady called Heidi Campbell, who's been studying this for as long as the digital revolution has been going on, really. And she had a worldwide conversation with different expressions of church, cross denominations, about their response to COVID and being online. If we go to the next slide. This is the one that we really want to hit home on, really. Throughout that whole paper, and it's quite a significant document, but there's a whole section from Heidi herself. And what I found really helpful, which I think maybe can help us as a diocese or help us as Christian leaders to kind of frame what we're responding with in our through this time, through the pandemic and beyond. She talks about transfer, translate, and transform. She says that for what she's been observing churches do, most of the time, a lot of churches, which is rightly so when we're reacting to something like this, They take what they've been doing offline and they do it online. We keep the traditional, the familiar structures, but we stream or we pre-record. We do what we know how to do, and we record that for the sake of getting stuff out there for our congregations. There's a translation model where we modify what we've been doing offline, but we adapt it to maybe better suit an online audience. You know, leaders replicate the kind of the core traditional familiar aspects of what we do in church, but we adjust it slightly to be a bit more digitally friendly. And then both of those seek to kind of replicate the core aspects of Christian worship, you know, in identifiable ways where people connect with. But then there's this maybe a slightly more out there one about transformation. It's about rethinking the essence of church. What do people need? What are we here for? What do we mean by church? And then we transform and we adjust our response accordingly. And it's about seeking, I think someone said about seeking participation and interaction from the people that are watching and that are engaging, rather than just allowing for that passive consumption, which we worry about in our culture in particular. But it's about engaging people online. And there are ways we can do that, and we can explore that in other sessions or etc. But they take into account both the physical and the digital lives that people lead, because that's what we do now. We exist in both realms. So transference, translation, and transformation. It just helps us to frame maybe our response and what we've been doing. If we go on to the next one, Tom. And then it strikes me that this fits in with, you know, for those in the Chelmsford Diocese, we've had this transforming presence vision as a diocese for a while now. And I know we're in the midst of getting a new diocesan bishop, but it's, you know, this is still so important. And it relates to what we're doing now, being a transforming presence, and particularly that idea of transforming what we do, how we are church, even without our church buildings, who we are, what we're doing in our communities. But I think these points, living distinctive lives in a Christian world, evangelizing effectively, holding ourselves accountable, developing a new vision for serving in a missional context. How can we take those and relate them to digital spaces? Because I think actually more and more now the church is needing to transform and evolve along with the culture that we live in. We go on to the next slide. And then this is literally my last one. So just some thoughts really. If God is present in humanity and humanity is present online, we need to, and I urge us to reconsider our approaches to contextual mission and how we do ministry in a digital age. And I just got some almost like little idea prompters there, you know, in terms of that framework, in terms of transfer, translate, and transform. Where do you feel your current ministry? How are you responding? You know, where do you fit into that framework? And do you feel, you know, you need to do more of one or more of the other? Perhaps it's a helpful way of framing where you're at. And then again, there are some theological things which this has all thrown up as well, which I'm very interested in having conversations around. You know, this affects our whole ministerial life, our whole liturgical life, and right across the board. And you've got some things down there, particularly sacraments are a big thing for us right now. So that's really what I wanted to share with us tonight, that this is the long game. We've been on this road for a while, and the digital revolution is ongoing and will keep going. And there are lots of ways that people are responding, and everyone's doing a great job. And I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Alan. And in a moment, we'll break out and there'll be an opportunity to reflect on some of that and discuss it with each other. Before we do, I'm just going to open up another presentation and very briefly just talk through some practical implications of all that and think about how we might plan in our own contexts around some of those sort of thoughts and reflections from Alan. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share a model with you which is taken from marketing and digital marketing in particular. So for sort of a different source material, if you like, but I think it's something that has very real relevance to what we are trying to do in parishes. And it's called customer journey mapping. Although obviously in this case, we're not talking about customers, but we're talking about people and audiences of people and who it is we want to reach and communicate with and engage through our communications. And in the diagram that you can see in front of you now, I've highlighted 3 very broad groups in blue around the edge. And these are 3 very broad audience group. Members of the public, people who aren't currently engaged in church activity in our communities in any way. Church participants, for want of a better term probably, but people who are engaged in some sort of church activity. Now that may mean that they are worshippers in our churches, but it may be that they're involved in other church activities such as toddler groups, etc. And thirdly, leaders in our churches, people who have a leadership role, some form of ministry through their church. Now, looking at the circle in the middle, you can see that the different audiences sit on a different point on the circle. And the purpose of our communications here, using this model, is to move people around the circle using our communications. So we use communications to encourage members of the public, up in the top right there, to get involved in church activity and participate. And once they're involved, we then use different communications to welcome them into the church, to nurture them on their journey of faith, and potentially to help them explore their own ministry, and in some cases become leaders in our churches. And as leaders, they then bring others towards the church through their own mission and ministry in the local community. So it becomes potentially, for some people, a virtuous circle. Now, this sort of model then really helps us to start to think about what digital and online media we might use and how we might use it for each audience. So here we can see the same diagram, but we've overlaid the different types of communications that might be used to move people around the circle at different stages. So you can now see that the members of the public may get involved in the church via other church members sharing church social media posts with their friends, for example. They then may click on a social media post onto a web page and indicate that they're interested in coming along to an event. And at that event, they may have a face-to-face conversation with someone who's been given the job of welcoming people to that event. They then may sign up to a church email list and start to receive the church newsletter. And whilst reading that, they may decide to join a Lent course, for example. And you can see that what's important here is that we don't think of digital as something separate or as an alternative to other types of communication that we may have used traditionally. It all needs to be integrated. We need to be using the right communication channels at the right time with the right audiences to communicate the right messages to achieve our objectives, to move people around the circle. Now, I said these groups, members of the public, church participants, leaders, are very broad, and it is very important at a base level that our communications mean we're accessible and open, communicating with everyone in our church communities. But at the same time, you may wish to think about running some specific campaigns targeted at particular groups where there's an opportunity to achieve a clear objective. For example, you might have a group of young parents at the local church school where you think there's an opportunity to engage them in a new Alpha course you might be running, for example. And it's important when we do this, that we try to get a good understanding of that audience before we start a campaign. And that means doing some very basic research rather than relying on our assumptions. So we might obviously find that if we're talking about young parents at a primary school, that there is information online, data, etc., about what social media channels those groups are likely to use. But I think one of the best ways that we can do this is simply to talk to people and bring groups of people together, perhaps people who are already involved in the church who come from those groups, but to ask them some fairly systematic questions. Be open with them and explain what you're trying to achieve and why it's important that you understand the group you're trying to communicate with. But to try to understand what people's objections or frustrations or concerns might be about engaging in activities like that, to try to understand what the opportunities are, what they think might work in encouraging people to get involved in activities, what media people use and what networks people are involved with in those communities. And this all helps to give you the information you need to then start plotting one of those circles for a particular campaign with a particular objective. The final sort of thing I want to bring in from sort of marketing theory and digital marketing theory in relation to this then is about analysis and information management, which digital communication gives us a real opportunity to use, because you can get almost instant feedback on what's working and what isn't, although it's important to recognise what information works, what different types of information are telling us. Are we getting people to respond to our calls to action? Filling out forms on Survey Monkey might show us that they're responding, but are we then following them up effectively? Do people watch our videos all of the way through, but then never click on the link that we want them to, so that we can engage with them further? And having a systematic approach to this is really important, so that we can understand at each point around that circle what's working. So just here are some examples of different metrics and what they tell us. So video views, which you can see on any social media post, will help to tell us where the content is interesting and engaging, and whether people are watching it all the way through, for example. Shares and retweets on social media will tell us, are we reaching people beyond the audiences of our followers? And that's really important for us when we're thinking of those sort of members of the public audience who probably aren't following us. But if members of our church are sharing church content, then it's probably reaching out to a wider audience. Comments on social media posts can give a good overview of how people feel about the content that we are posting. Click-through rate, and when you send out emails with things such as MailChimp, or when you put social media posts online, you can see what proportion of people who see the email or see the social media post are clicking through to a web page. And that tells you whether your content is effective at driving action and getting people to communicate back. And then there's more qualitative and subjective feedback from attendees at events, talking to people about how they've found things, etc., and how they think things are going, or what communications they have found useful. So hopefully that sort of brings in some sort of an alternative ideas which help us to think about some of the things that Alan talked about, and help people to take that away and start to think about what it means to their own context, and how they can turn that into a plan within their own parishes. What we're going to do now, very briefly, is we're going to go back into breakout groups for 10 minutes, just to think about the two presentations and to have that conversation. How might you apply some of the concepts that have been discussed? And I think in particular, the 3 T's that Alan discussed, but then also the planning in your own context. We won't feed back on this one. This is an opportunity for you to discuss this amongst yourselves, but we'll then run a question and answer session at the end. And if anyone has anything in particular that comes out of their group that they'd like to share, then please do feel free to do so in that question and answer session. And just to remind you, please put those question and answers into the chat box. While people are in breakout groups, we'll look through that and pull some questions together to deal with. And I'll also ask Alan perhaps to not go into a breakout group so he can give me the feedback that I missed from the first one, and we can try and pick up anything that we think we've missed. I'm conscious of time, so we will try and make sure we are wrapped up by 8:30, basically. Okay. Throughout this evening, and we will try and deal with those now. It's not too late. If there's anything coming out of the breakout groups, or if you have a question, please pop it in the chat group, and I'll go back in there after we've done this round of questions, and just to see if there's anything else we should pick up before we finish. Some people have asked, we've tried to sort of group the together on themes in some cases, or is on that, so please do join that, but we won't keep you waiting. I'll ask James just to talk a little bit, particularly about the cost of streaming and the different options. So thanks.
Yeah, so so with the cost of the streaming, there's a couple of different options, and there is the resources and stuff actually on the Diocese website, so we'll post that link as well. So you can actually start sort of live streaming and sort of broadcasting your services, even with your, if you've got a smartphone now, so just with an iPhone or an Android phone, you can either record the session now and obviously broadcast it straight to Facebook Live or YouTube Live, or you can use some bits of software. So one of the free bits of software I'd recommend is a bit of software called OBS Studio. It's an open source platform, and it allows you basically to have like a studio view, so you can control the streaming and stuff that you're broadcasting live to the people who are not in the service. So that's obviously kind of one option. And another option obviously is getting more of a camera, so you could get a video camera. So I bought a video camera from my church. I think we paid £280 for a Panasonic, and I just put that on a tripod at the back of the church on a Sunday morning, link it into the software from OBS, and obviously I can then just broadcast live to YouTube, and obviously we share that on our Facebook pages as well and on our website. So it's very reasonably kind of cheap to get going, and like I say, from your own phones now, just with a £10 tripod or something that you can organise and buy from Amazon just to actually put out to support it. Obviously you can pay something like £200-300 for a camera to actually have a bit more control. Obviously you can go up and pay £1,000 for cameras as well. So those are kind of a few kind of quick options, but there's a whole lot of stuff on the Diocese website that will kind of go through how you can stream it, a beginner's guide, actually making the videos, how to kind of set it up on your phone, and going through, and how to actually use YouTube and Facebook. So I'm not going to cover that now because it can be a little bit detailed, but there's a lot of stuff on our website. There's a lot of stuff on the National Church website as well, on the DigiLab side of things. So they also talk about how you can set up streaming and set up premieres and stuff of actually just broadcasting your videos and your sermons, etc. One thing you will just need to bear in mind is licenses on music as well. So if you're broadcasting your service, you just need to make sure you've got a license for that. So CCLI have a bolt on now that you can, for an online session that's relatively cheap. It depends on the amount of people you're broadcasting to, but I think our one was around about £50 and stuff for a year. So we're not talking huge amounts of money for that as well. So I'll send the link out again in a second into the chat. So it'll give you kind of an idea, but there's lots of different ways of doing it, but if anyone's got any more more in-depth questions, then you can drop me a message in the chat now, and we can maybe follow up with a Zoom call after this session if that helps.
Wonderful, thank you, James. So there's also a question from Jane about concern that some churches perhaps are retreating back to how they did things before, now that their buildings are open. Clearly many churches are not doing that, but how do we make sure we don't lose what we've learned and developed over recent months? Alan, I don't know if you've got any reflections on that.
Yeah, definitely. It was a really good question, actually. And I think I feel the same way, really, that there is a danger with all these things, that we make a lot of progress in what we're doing, and then all of a sudden, you know, when we can, we retreat back to what we know. And I guess the only way we can try to avoid that on many levels is having these kind of conversations, trying to do as many of these type of things as we possibly can when it comes to our own ministries and what we're doing. I mean, I'm an advocate for not retreating back to the building. I'm an advocate for being away from our buildings as far as we possibly can get, and I know that's just me. But at the same time, I'm aware that we live in a culture where actually we're holding these two things in tension. So the only way we can do that well, I think, is to continue to have strong conversations, and, you know, keep encouraging one another when we see each other doing well online, rather that, you know, we can always get into a tendency to compete. But rather than, you know, sort of getting into that mindset of saying, well, I saw something you did online, I saw something you did on Facebook or on your website, and I just want to encourage you, that was great. You know, I think that's how we kind of keep a forward momentum. And also recognizing that, you know, I know I was talking a lot about digital natives, etc., but, you know, across the board, digital engagement is about engagement. It's about connecting with people, and it's about you know, making people feel like you're physically together until you can be physically together. It's not about you know, completely reinventing the wheel. It's all about community and relationships, and, you know, we've all been doing that all our life. So yeah, so I'm with you. I don't want us to retreat back, and we need to keep the conversation going so we don't.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Okay, a couple of questions came in on issues of reaching different generations online, both in terms of children, young people, families, etc., and then also older people and people who may be digitally excluded, not just older people, of course. In terms of younger people, there are questions about how it's done well, and again, we'll provide you with some links for this in the follow-up. Our youth and families team have put together some resources on that, and I think possibly a video as well. We'll send out a link to that. There's also a question about the implications for safeguarding, which are really important, obviously, when dealing with younger people online. That the link that James has just put into the chat includes, if you look on that page, there is advice on safeguarding and digital communications, and it's obviously really important that that is done, that's done correctly, and there's advice on that. Also, when you're creating digital content with anyone in that you're going to publish, it's important that you get relevant permissions, and if it's a minor, that you get permissions from parents or guardians. And there's a Church of England form on that webpage for you to get that information, to make sure that you've got permission for those people to appear in any videos or photographs, etc. Obviously, the older people question. I mean, I think the first thing to say about that is it's really important that we don't make assumptions, and a lot of what we've picked up, not only from around the diocese but from the church more widely, is actually online church has been liberating for some older people who were having difficulty going to church pre-COVID, and they've been able to engage in church in ways that they weren't before that. So we shouldn't assume that online church is necessarily something for younger people. And actually that's sort of backed up by a lot of the statistics and numbers anyway, that there are huge numbers of older people are online now, and we mustn't make assumptions that they're not. But then clearly, whether they're older people or not, there are people who are excluded digitally for a variety of reasons. And it's really important. There's a real danger for us here that those people become excluded. Sometimes that is really difficult, especially when we're in sort of full lockdown situations where we can't meet in person. And it's important, obviously, that we work hard to navigate that and get around that. I think when we think back to the model we were talking about before, where we are essentially, we're putting people first, the audience first, and then working out how do we reach those people and how do we communicate with them. It's important that we're alert to that and think about that in all our communications. And how are we making sure that we're reaching everyone in our church communities and in the wider community that we want to and need to. In some cases that won't be online. In some cases there might be potential to reach people online, but we're just not doing what we might be able to do to help them to get there. Now, if that's about resources and money, that's probably harder, but it might be. There was an example in, I think Citizens ran Zoom training sessions, and they got students at Essex University, I think, to run some beginners Zoom classes for anyone who wanted to get involved, and that was publicised in other churches in the area. And people came along and they showed them the ropes on Zoom, and it was a comfortable way for people to start feeling more comfortable with Zoom. And so there are things like that you might be able to look at. But it's a real question. In many ways, it's about us staying focused on making sure we don't stray into excluding people through this without making assumptions about people at the same time. Let me get my questions back up. I think those are all the ones that had come in before. James, have you seen anything new that's popped up?
No, there's no other questions. If anyone wants to drop anything into the chat now quickly.
I will give people a chance to do that by sort of doing the closing spiel, and then we can come back to it if there is anything. So first of all, a huge thank you to everyone for participating this evening. It's the first one of these we've done, and we're going to send out a feedback form to you in the next couple of days. So we'd really appreciate forward. They'll vary quite a lot in terms of content, and the next session I think is on the 10th of November and is about live streaming, so it'll be much more practical. But nevertheless, we'll do other sessions like this, and it will be really good to get your feedback from them. So we'll send that out to you. We'll also make this available on the online church webpage that James has circulated. I haven't seen any more questions coming in.
No,
one of the things I know we've done is overrun slightly, for which I apologise. So I will say goodbye to you all and hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you very much.